Welcome to The Village. The Village is a virtual gathering space where a range of educators and community members meet and discuss topics that are important and essential in our daily lives as educators and community members. My name is Bev Bell, and I direct graduate education programs at Mount Holyoke College, and I have the privilege of co-hosting The Village with Lily Eisenman.
Hi everyone, my name is Lily. I graduated from the MAT program in 2015 and I currently teach 7th grade science in Springfield, Massachusetts.
So we'd like to welcome all the participants tonight, especially our MAT students. Welcome to class. So tonight it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Gwen Bass, to be our guest. Gwen, if you could welcome Gwen.
Hi there.
Thanks, Dr. Gwen Bass. So Gwen directs our Master of Arts in Teacher Leadership program here in the grad programs at Mount Holyoke College. But more importantly for this evening, Gwen was the person that I collaborated with and who did most of the work to put together our Master of Arts in Teaching Moderate Disabilities initial license. And it's within that realm of her trillion different talents and things that she does that we're asking her to work with us this evening. So basically, this evening, what we're going to do for the format for this evening is we're going to have Dr. Bass provide us with a series of questions to frame the conversations that we're going to have this evening. Thereafter, she'll take us through 6 habits of mind to try and cultivate more effective inclusion classrooms. Thereafter, so that should take us about 25 to 30 minutes. Thereafter, we're going to be divided into breakout rooms, and our technical expert, Lauren Jones, will apparently be able to put you all into different breakout rooms, and you're going to develop further the particular habit of mind that you've been assigned to. Somebody in the group or everyone in the group can type into the Google folder. You can chat within your group. We'll leave you in there for about 10 minutes, and then we'll bring you all back to the main room, and Gwen will then be available for questions and answers. These Google Docs will then be shared with everybody, all the participants that signed on, including those that applied to or registered for this evening. So are we ready? Everyone ready? Gwen, you ready?
Ready.
All right, Gwen, tell us a little bit more about how you believe inclusive strategies are actually developed by educators and for classrooms.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you initially thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you all. And when we began talking about it, I started to think about what are some of the specific strategies that teachers need to know. And one of the issues I kept thinking about was that we could talk about strategies, but if they don't actually resonate with a particular person in their context, they're kind of meaningless. And so I really feel like inclusive strategies are pretty much developed by people who have really thought about sort of how they want to be intentional in their practice, what they want students to gain from the experience of being in their classroom. And those strategies that somebody's ultimately going to use really need to be originated from the person who is going to be implementing them based on their own philosophy.
Right. And could you speak to how you would encourage teachers to start thinking about inclusive teaching in their classrooms?
Mm-hmm. I think initially teachers really need to, again, be clear about your philosophy. What is it that you want students to know? How do you want to show up in your own space? How do you want students to feel when they're in your space? And part of what the process is, especially as a new teacher, but also as a veteran teacher, is really being clear about how am I checking to make sure that I'm doing all of the things that I want to be doing? So not just do I think that I might be doing some of the things that might help people feel included, but what am I doing to check in with my students, their families, other teachers? How am I really creating a space and reflecting on my own practice to ensure that I'm really self-monitoring and doing what I need to adjust?
So basically, not only are we really reflecting, we're sort of being reflexive in that we're responding to what we find out as we reflect and engage with our learners.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, I want you to all sit back now, put on those headphones, and Gwen will take us through what she considers sort of habits of mind as you consider reaching all your learners. Lauren will be playing the PowerPoint, but you'll still be able to see Gwen up in the top corner of your thing. Thank you, Gwen.
Absolutely. So some of the questions that I want us to have in mind for this conversation, and I think these are the important questions that you need to be asking yourselves as educators, and I'm sure that there are plenty more that could go on this list. But initially, I kind of feel like part of the process, right, is knowing yourself and thinking about what it is you need to know about your own biases and blind spots, and what is it that you want to put out in the world as a professional, and how do you want your students to exist in your space, and what kind of experience do you want them to have as learners. So to frame this conversation, I'm going to think about what do I know and understand about each of my students? Who are they? Who are their families? What are their learning needs? What kind of goals do I have for them? What kind of group goals do I have? How do I want collaboration to happen in my classroom? How do I want students to interact? Are there specific experiences that I want them to have in group problem solving or in navigating social dynamics? And what are the individual experiences that I want them to have as well? And then thinking about how do you honor your students? What do you do to let them know that there's room in your classroom for them? That even if you don't necessarily represent all of the needs or sort of individual characteristics of each of your students, how do they know from you that they can feel safe in that space? How do their families know they can feel included? And that kind of ties to this idea of how do you want your students to feel, right? It's one thing to have students, to encourage your students or figure out ways to help your students kind of go through the process of learning, just from the standpoint of I'm giving you some task and then you're completing it. But there's another piece around this qualitative feeling. And I think the more we learn about educational outcomes for kids, the more we kind of understand that the social, emotional, and sort of historically thought of as like soft skills around learning and grit and all of those pieces are actually, in many cases, way more valuable than whatever content you're going to teach somebody. So then I think another question is thinking about how you want to embody your professional role. Some people walk into a classroom and their primary goal is just really to affect the particular students in that room on that day. Other people, and especially over time, sort of think about how do I want to engage in my school community? What kind of leadership role do I want to take on? Do I want to figure out how to create professional learning communities? How can I collaborate with other people? All of those pieces I think are really important to be thinking about. And then I think the other piece is like really even from and I'll talk about this again in a minute, but thinking about like an inclusive strategy that really involves practicing what you preach. So if you are an educator who's talking about wanting all of your students to feel safe and included and challenged and supported, what are you doing in your classroom every day to show them that you're collaborating with adults to support them? So there are 6 habits of mind that I think all inclusive teachers embodied. One of them is this idea of individually responsive teaching, which to me sort of extends this idea of culturally responsive teaching. And there you're really thinking about, what do I know about my students? What do I specifically want to make sure I'm addressing from a learning standpoint? So do they have specific areas of strength or challenge? Are there other things that they need to be working on as far as social skills or other pragmatic skills? I think there's another piece too around just really, so it's sort of like when I think about individually responsive teaching, I sort of think about like culturally responsive teaching plus. So what am I doing to reflect my students in my classroom? What kinds of text do I have on my walls? Things like that. How do I create opportunities within the structure of my classroom so that students feel heard and have the opportunity to share ideas? What kinds of explicit things am I doing in my curriculum to make sure that students feel like they're being challenged and they're being engaged? So do I have it, and I'll give you some more examples in a minute, but do I have activities in my classroom that specifically relate to student interests? And then when I talk about implicit curriculum, what I mean is really sort of like what messages are students getting about what my values are. So am I, like in my own teaching, if I challenge one student to really think through some process and really support them sort of in a public way through a group activity, I'm showing the class that I have high expectations for that student, right? And if I don't do that for all of my students, I'm potentially sending the message that I don't think all students can succeed. And so I think there's a piece there around really making sure that we as educators are being careful about the implicit messages that we're giving to our students. And again, I'll talk more about that in a minute. And then I think there's another piece that's important to be thinking about is the kinds of message students receive about difference. What do they know about the world around them, and what kinds of folks are successful in what ways? and how can they sort of relate to some of the experiences of other people who they have that, you know, you're bringing into your classroom as role models. And again, like I said a minute ago, just kind of maintaining high expectations for all students and really addressing some of those pieces around holistic development. So I think about that not only as sort of like the social emotional learning piece, but also how do I really get to know my students and know their families and think about who they are going to go, what kind of world they are each going to go out into. Because as a person, when you just think about a classroom full of students, right, you have some students who may have diagnosed disabilities, other students who have other sort of like identities that all enter the classroom, right? But as they are going back out into the world, what do they need to be prepared so that they can feel safe and secure, so they can self-advocate and they have the skills they need to be successful? And I'll give you some examples of this. So some of these examples are more specific and some are broader. One is kind of thinking about the literature you have in your classroom, potentially using social stories that reflect students in your class. There are some really great children's books about particular issues students have, so around executive functioning, difficulty paying attention, and sometimes having the opportunity to share those with students and give them the chance to relate to someone else's story about having a hard time, for example, sitting still in class, can be an effective tool for sort of explicitly talking about some of those skills. Even things like using word problems that have individuals in them, like in math, that have individuals in them with a range of needs and contexts, explicitly including curriculum that offers multiple perspectives. So if I'm going to do a book report unit and we're going to be talking about biographies, who am I including in that list of potential books? How am I making sure that my students have access to a range of folks? Talking to students about their needs. I think one of the things that we in education sometimes really struggle with, and certainly in the classes that I've taught around inclusion, one question that often comes up is how explicit to make difference, right? So if you have a student in your class who's struggling in a particular way that's pretty apparent to the other students in the class, should we talk about it? Should we not talk about it? And I think as much as we can really engage with students about who they are and sort of showcase in our rooms, hey, we have a range of learners in here. We're all working on different things. There are some responsibilities we have to support each other. There are some ways in which we're different, similar struggles, all of those kinds of things. I think that can be really beneficial to students. And again, just making sure that the classroom climate has input from everybody. So, you know, if some students really struggle with working in a time when things are particularly quiet and other students kind of need a little background noise to work, making sure that you're creating a situation that's going to meet everybody's needs, and developing lessons that are accessible to everybody. The Universal Design for Learning model is one example of a way that you can do that. And then I'll talk about this when we talk about data a little bit, but thinking about consciously monitoring your responses to students. So how are you praising students? Are you focusing on making sure that they feel like their efforts are worthwhile? Or are you kind of evaluatively praising them? Do they know what they should be doing? And how can we really encourage students to have a growth mindset? And the second thing that I was thinking about in relation to inclusion, I think we need to kind of have in mind as educators is this notion of a team, right? So as part of the legal aspect of the IDEA, a team of individuals who all have various lenses through which they explore student learning is required by law to meet annually to review student progress. I think what's really important as an educator is to make sure that all of the members of that team have really, really good access to the students who they're serving. So thinking about how can I invite a speech pathologist into my classroom who's working with a student? And how can I help them really feel like there's something they could offer me that could serve the student they're working with and maybe other students too? And how can we share information in two ways? You know, so how can I say, hey, this is what I'm trying and this is what I think I might need to do. And I took this goal that they had related to speech and I attempted to do something in my classroom. Do you think this might work? And really kind of share those ideas. And also thinking about like the other team members. So it's making sure that administrators get positive views of students in your classroom who may or may not be on IEPs. But I think in general, when you can include a range of professionals in your room, you get a lot of perspectives. And if students can really see that you're positively communicating with those folks, it can kind of be a really great opportunity to model for them what it looks like to engage everybody in that process of really thinking carefully about how to do things best. And it can also really kind of help the student to see that everybody is on their team, and not just their team, right? But like really supporting them and helping them to develop self-advocacy skills. So some examples, some are relatively concrete. Establishing a weekly meeting time with specialists who serve the students in your classroom or on your caseload. When are you making sure that you have proactive time to connect with people about things that may or may not be working for individual students? Developing a resource library or online platform where everyone can share ideas and strategies. And that is one way that you can really include families too, and make sure that they have access to sort of regular updates on how their child is, how things are progressing for their child. Inviting caregivers into classroom on a routine basis or for explicit programming related to specific students. And what I was thinking there is, you know, sometimes you might have a student who has a particular need, like I was saying before, and it feels obvious to everybody who's in the room, and they're sort of wondering, are we supposed to talk about this need? Are we not supposed to talk about this need? And sometimes families are really like great folks to bring into the classroom and say, this is what our family looks like. This is what this particular disability looks like in the community. And that can be kind of like a nice conversation opener. Again, I feel like in order to do that kind of thing, you have to really be embodying an inclusive practice. And we can talk more about that in the question and answer part if people are interested. But I think that there is really opportunity there to kind of make explicit some of those conversations that people are afraid to have. And again, just making sure from a team perspective that students know what their goals are and how each of the members of their teams can work together to really support them in making the progress they need to make. The third habit of mine is establishing safety. So thinking about how your classroom environment shows students that they're safe. And I mean safety from just like a pure, like, do students feel comfortable in this room? Do they feel like their needs are going to be met? And then do they feel like they have the security and the support to take risks, to ask questions, to build relationships with their peers? Do they feel like they'll be listened to? Are there good structures in place to support students in developing new knowledge and like really challenging themselves? And I think that kind of begins from the very start of school year, but it can certainly be revisited on a regular basis when you can check in with your students and say, what do you need to feel safe in a school setting? I think we as educators often think we've asked our students that question and we haven't. Thinking about, and another piece kind of goes along with like just really making sure that you're checking in about your own limitations. How well do you know yourself? What are some of the blind spots that you may have about how your own identities or experiences or perceptions may be shaping the way that you're interacting with your students? And what can you do to kind of ask them to hold you accountable or think about how to hold yourself accountable? Again, the piece around explicit and implicit messages, there are things we tell our students outright and there are things we show our students through our behavior. And I think it's really important for us to find ways to track some of that stuff. And then there's a piece around inclusion, like inclusive language. And so that's things like using person first language and avoiding using certain slang terms or derogatory terms, either in, both like in all of your communication in your classroom so that there's not any chance that a student might feel excluded based on the language you're using. So some examples here are, like I was saying, kind of thinking about what the environment should look like and asking students to participate in that process, developing group expectations and making sure that you have a system for how students are going to give each other feedback on how things are going. And maybe that's even something like every month we're going to check in as a group and talk about something that we think is going well and something that we think we need to collaborate on a little bit differently. Developing relationships with students related to their interests and needs. So finding out from your students what it is that they are really engaged by and finding ways to help them feel engaged in your curriculum and what's happening in your classroom by including those pieces. I've seen some pretty amazing work from a number of teachers who kind of model the goal setting process. So every week, everybody's writing a goal and then they kind of check in with each other, think about what steps they need to take to meet that goal for the week. And then at the end of the week, they sort of follow up on how they think it went and what they might do differently. Having explicit opportunities and structured activities where students can practice risk-taking. So that can be modeling something where the teacher is taking the opportunity to show students explicitly what it looks like to take a risk, or telling a story or sharing an experience they've had where they took a risk and they had to kind of demonstrate some perseverance to make the progress they wanted to make towards the goal. And then having a range of activities so that students really feel like there's something happening in this classroom that works for me and that's going to meet my needs. I think it's really important for us to think also about what it is our individual students need to be successful. And part of that comes back to what I said in the first slide around, we can teach students any number of strategies or using any number of strategies, but if we're not really thinking about what it is we as educators each, and this is sort of like a personal answer, what is it that you feel like students need to know as a result of being in your classroom? So that's one piece. And then also just making sure that we're not assuming that students have the skills they need to be successful when they walk in the door. So we know that disproportionate representation in special education is a huge issue. And that a lot of students are misidentified for sociocultural reasons, and then are designated into special education. And once students are in special education, the outcomes are often far worse for those folks than they are for students in general ed. So really making sure that we're actively teaching the skills students need to learn anything. So executive functioning skills, the planning, the organizing, those pieces, the self-monitoring. Making sure that all students have the background knowledge they need, and that you find ways to embed that in your classroom that are not stigmatizing. So it's not that a student has to ask, oh, I don't know this, or oh, I've never experienced this. It's that you're setting the stage in a way that you're assuming zero knowledge and you're challenging each student where they are. And then also thinking about making sure that you have really good strategies for risk-taking again. Working with students to create and implement checklists and graphic organizers is an example of that, so that when students don't have an adult sitting with them saying, hey, what assignments do you have coming up? They have a good system and an internalized system for being able to track some of those pieces, and they can use those in other elements of their life. Providing students with a range of lessons, talking explicitly about the learning process, like teaching students about how brain function works, incorporating activities that require group collaboration, and making sure that you're actually talking about group dynamics as a component of the learning process. Being specific when you're asking students to work in a group about what the goal is, and what each person in the group needs to do in order to achieve that goal. And then again, also making sure that you're really involving parents in that process. Most parents would be really happy for their children to be able to effectively execute certain organizational tasks, like getting ready in the morning or packing their bag or all of those pieces. And I think the more we can invite, then there are a number of board games that address some of these planning skills related to particularly executive functioning. But I think the more that we can do to kind of engage with families and say, hey, try this strategy or work on this checklist or think about playing this game with your child and talking about how this could actually transfer into something that will help them learn, not just in my classroom, but for the rest of their lives. Teachers, in my experience, generally dislike data, but I think that's because we teachers have the assumption that data is something that doesn't really apply to the things that matter. And so I'd like us to reconsider that a little bit and think about data from the perspective, in this case, of what do I need to know about my students, and not just their academic learning, but also their social emotional skills, their functioning as a group, and then thinking about how do you collect that information. So data being, in this case, the idea of what do I think I value in my classroom and how am I making sure that I'm actually achieving my goals? How can I create meaningful and differentiated lessons? And how am I really monitoring formally and informally what students are learning? So a student can achieve a particular score on a test, but how am I really checking to make sure that they've implemented the study skills that they should be implementing, and that they've addressed all of the learning objectives that I have for that particular subject? So it's really thinking about alignment between your learning objectives and your assessments. And then thinking about what strategies you can embed in your classroom structure to make sure that you're monitoring student behavior and social dynamics. One of those pieces can be thinking about how you use your students to give you that feedback, or maybe a colleague, or how you yourself are taking that data. Thinking about what your own teaching goals are and how you're checking in to see how you're doing on those. And then I think one of the pieces that makes this so important, this data piece, is not only because I think things can get a little gray and fuzzy when we think students feel good about being in our classes. We sometimes lose sight of making sure that we're actually supporting their progress in all areas. Vice versa, if we're really focused on one aspect of their learning and monitoring that, we may not very effectively be making sure that we're addressing all of the other components that go into the learning process. But I think we can really use that information to make sure we're advocating for our students and that we're supporting them in self-advocacy. So if we have good information about what works for a student and what helps them to learn and what helps them to feel successful in school and remain connected, that's really valuable information for that student to have. So they can share it with other teachers, they can share it with the folks who are going to be generating their IP, all of that. And then thinking about sort of this evaluative process of using data to refine practice. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So like I said a minute ago, just really thinking about your lessons with specific objectives and aligning those really carefully to your assessments and having rubrics in place that really target the key aspects of the learning that you're trying to achieve, the goals you're trying to achieve. An example of having students collect data, having them track how often they speak up in class. If you notice there's an imbalance in your classroom in terms of like how airspace is being shared, that's one way that you can ask students to take some of that data. And maybe some students need to be reminded, you know what, I should actually not talk so much because I talked 10 times, and other students might just need to have a goal of speaking up once in class. So you can use that information. You both use it as data and as sort of like an engagement strategy. You could also invite a student or invite a colleague in to track the behavior relative to a particular skill. So maybe you want to know the complexity of the questions you're asking to various students, or maybe you want to know how often you're calling on students from various backgrounds or with different identities. And you could invite someone in to kind of monitor that for you and give you that feedback. I think there's another piece around making sure that we're gathering good information about students' social and emotional skills. Often in special education and in schools in general, the students, it's like sort of a squeaky wheel gets the oil scenario, where the students who demonstrate the most sort of like the loudest, most alarming social challenges or behavioral outbursts are the kids who we notice. And it's often there are kids who are sitting quietly, more or less appearing to comply and kind of follow the expectations of school, who may or may not be kind of struggling in different ways that are sort of more around internalizing behaviors. And one of the ways I think we can really make sure we're capturing some of those students is by being clear and having systems for monitoring those pieces. And then again, using this data to talk with people in your building about how to better serve your students, about what they're experiencing in school, about some of the progress that they're making. And another really straightforward example of a strategy for collecting meaningful data could be around a functional behavior assessment. So identifying a challenging behavior and really getting to the bottom of what it is that's causing that behavior and reinforcing it. Finally, I think we often set really high goals for ourselves, especially as novice teachers, around all of the things we think we're going to accomplish in our classroom. And I think very often we find ourselves feeling like we're just not doing enough, and we're running ourselves ragged. And special education in particular has an incredibly high burnout rate. So I think it's important to really focus on self-care and how you're taking care of yourselves, and also how you're setting reasonable goals. So we wouldn't set goals for our students that were unreasonable and then get frustrated when they didn't meet them. And I think often if we can have the same level of compassion with ourselves and think about what's a reasonable amount, what's a reasonable amount of progress I can expect for myself, and what will that look like? How can I really think proactively about what I'm going to need to be able to sustain my well-being so that I can actually be supportive to my students and colleagues? How can I set boundaries around my time, which is incredibly hard in education? you could work all day, every day, and probably still feel like you didn't reach out to enough people and you didn't think enough about the lessons you were going to prepare, and your students could still use something else from you. But I think it's really important to be clear about what kinds of boundaries you want to set around your students and around your time, particularly because not only is that going to support teachers in kind of self-preservation and self-care, but it also really models for students that we don't have exceedingly high expectations, that you can kind of go and go and go without needing some time to regenerate. And then also, what kind of strategies can I use to facilitate my own process of self-reflection and refinement? What do I have in place that's really, for me, that's really reminding me to check in about how I'm doing and is giving me some really good, valuable information about how things are going in my classroom? So some examples, like I said, just having a consistent, like every Friday, I'm going to check in about how I did on these particular lessons, or what students got out of my group activities. Having a weekly goal along with your students, like I was saying at the beginning, that's one strategy people can sometimes use to help make that process of risk-taking a little bit more clear. Asking your students for feedback on certain teaching strategies and class activities, finding out what's working for them and what's not, establishing a process or a practice of making sure that you're engaged in self-care. For some people, that's exercising or mindfulness or having a hobby or something that defines you beyond your identity as a teacher in a building, because that's a really important part of who you are, and it's also part of who you are. And if we are over-defined by any one part of who we are, I think it often gets in the way of us being able to sort of have that self-compassion I was talking about a minute ago. And then developing a strategy for assessing whether or not your goals are reasonable. So like I said, I think we often start with these ideas, these big ideas about all of the things we're going to do. And we may do all of those things, but it's often unreasonable to pursue them on the timelines we set for ourselves. So just being a little bit patient and thinking about, again, thinking about your students and what kinds of goals you would let them establish and how you would want them to feel successful, and setting yourself up for the same kind of success. So like I said in the beginning, part of my goal here is to kind of give you some strategies and some ways to be thinking about these things, but we're also going to give you the opportunity to work in groups. So in your breakout groups, you're each going to be thinking about and discussing a particular habit of mind. We want you to try to capture at least 5 different ideas on the Google Doc that relates to your topic. We'll give you 10 minutes for this activity. And so as you enter the room, if you can say your name, open the Google link, and then chat while you type, that would be great.
Welcome back, everyone. We are now in the question and answer portion. If we could have Gwen come back on our screens, please. Hi, Gwen.
Hey there.
So if you have a question for Dr. Bass, please type it into the chat box, and then we will call on you and you can ask your question directly.
So Gwen, a question that I have just as we're waiting for questions is, so often you hear teachers say that they don't have time, they just don't have time to do all of this. So, how do we help people realize that this actually saves time, I would imagine, in the end, and actually helps to manage a classroom and sort of gets rid of a lot of other things, issues that could pop up?
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's just it. I mean, I think as long as if we're really being thoughtful about our practice and we're really thinking about what we want our students to gain and how we're going to feel at the end of the day if it doesn't go well, then we need to be thinking about these things ahead of time. At the end of the day, you're going to be run ragged because you thought ahead of everything and you worked really hard and it executed it perfectly, or you're going to be exhausted and overwhelmed because you didn't think about this stuff and it kind of came around to bite you in a way that didn't work for you in your day. So I really do feel like it's part of an intentional practice. Is really, it doesn't have to be something that you do that's extra. And I actually think that novice teachers are in a pretty ideal situation for implementing some of these things. One of the examples I often give is that when I came into teaching, they had just reestablished the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, and everyone around me was totally overwhelmed because they felt like they had to rewrite all of their lessons. And for me, I felt like, oh, well, I've never had a whole year's worth of lessons planned before, so this is my opportunity to do this the way that I'm supposed to do it. And so I think as you're starting out in your practice, and you're thinking about what kind of teacher you want to be, this is the perfect time to be thinking about what kinds of little strategies you can implement. And you're going to evolve those over time. But I do think it's an opportunity.
I think one of the strategies that I really liked that you shared was about sort of helping to have students collect data, not only on themselves, you know, that sort of self-monitoring of how to, enter in and pull back. And I mean, that's hard for many of us, right? But I mean, if you're saying to students, help me monitor how I am engaging with all of you, how I am having a classroom that's safe for everybody. Just on a piece of paper, every time you ask a question, just make a check mark and hand it in to me at the end. Maybe I'm not calling on everybody. Maybe I'm not asking questions that actually promote the opportunity to really think and respond. And so that way we sort of monitor our own questioning technique or our own practice, and the students feel invested because they're the ones that are helping you monitor it.
Mm-hmm.
So I really like that idea, specifically for myself.
Yeah.
So is there anyone else online that would like to ask a question of Dr. Basque? As Lily calls your name, please unmute your mic and show us your video so we can have a nice chat.
So we're going to hear from Ethan.
Okay, so I don't have a video, so sorry. My question is, what are some good techniques for collecting data in your classroom? Because I think that's something that can be pretty difficult unless you have some sort of procedures in place.
Mm-hmm. When you say collecting data, is there like a particular thing that you've talked about in your group, or that you're really working on, or you think your students are working on that you want to collect data around?
That's I wasn't expecting you to ask me a question.
I don't mean to like turn your question into a question that I'm asking you. Let me give you a blanket answer, and then if this doesn't do it, you can come back to me with another question.
Thank you.
No problem. So I think part of it is again really being clear about what your goals are. So if you have a particular area of like something that is your blind spot, and one of the things I was thinking about as Bev was talking, right, about just even the example of having students kind of self-monitor and kind of collect that data about who's speaking out and responding to questions, is that you can also tailor that data and say, okay, hey students, I'm going to try something different today. I know that if I ask a question, some of your hands are going to go up right away, and some of you are not going to even have the chance to think about the question before someone else already answers it. So I'm going to try a strategy today where I wait for 30 seconds and then I ask everyone to put their hands up. And then having the students participate in that process of seeing if there's a difference in like how often they are likely to respond or not respond. So I was just kind of thinking about like, there are all these ways. It really kind of depends on what it is that you want to keep track of. There are some really simple tools that you could probably develop informally based on your setting that just remind you to check in about particular things. So maybe you have a list of sort of character skill, like sort of those soft skills I was talking about, like collaboration or perseverance or things like that, that you want to just kind of make sure you're really thinking about each of your students and how they're doing in those areas. That can be something that you develop a really informal checklist around. Similarly, like, I don't know, maybe you want to make sure your students are organized and you want to have a particular checklist around helping them do that kind of thing. I think the more efficiently you can collect those pieces of information, the better. And honestly, often it's just a matter of having that reminder there. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be like some big, huge data collection thing. It can just be you checking in a way that you've sort of like systematically organized. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think so, yeah. I think, it's a good point that you have to think about the kind of data you want to collect. I remember when we were talking about in your class, like the kind of questions we ask students. I think like that would be a really, a good thing to think about as teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like you said, just like a checklist is an easy enough way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question is coming from Molly. So please unmute.
Hey, I was wondering what you think about having your students participate in developing the consequences for different things in the classroom. I have an SP that does that, and I could see it going really, really great and also going really, really wrong. I was wondering if you had thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm. My initial reaction is that that's like a really great idea. It seems like something that, like students tend to buy into those kinds of systems a lot more too when they're a part of creating them. And I think that sort of group process as a group, and some of the restorative justice and the restorative practices models have some sort of a similar orientation around what do I need to do to be a successful and like respectful member in this community, and then when I make a mistake, how do I fix it? And so I think that those kinds of strategies are actually really great, and I do think that there is some level of making sure that you as a teacher sort of facilitate those consequences or the feedback in a way that works and is consistent and kind of gives you what you need as the instructor for the class. But I also feel like that sounds like a pretty great model. If you have a group of students, you can really corral into thinking about meaningful consequences.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Molly. And for our last question, we're going to go to Lauren.
So this question is actually from Sarah, but she has no voice. And her question is, how does internal and external motivation play into having students monitor themselves?
It's a really good question. I think I think generally what we kind of know about the way to encourage internal motivation, if you're thinking about students who may not be internally, I don't know if this is the orientation of a question, but if you're thinking about students who may not necessarily be internally motivated to do some of the things that we as their teachers may think they should be doing, I think often it can work really well to start with external motivation. And then sort of with the goal of transitioning to having the student really focus on their own self-monitoring. So in that way, I think those kinds of, the strategies can work really well to encourage both. But I do think that in general, self-monitoring will actually support people who are internally motivated because they'll already be thinking about, okay, how do I want to do? What are my goals? And then the folks who are more externally motivated may kind of look around and say, oh, looks like other people are sort of making different progress than I am. What do I need to be doing differently?
All right, thank you so much for those questions. Gwen, thank you so much for all your preparation around this and for sort of incorporating so many real easy, just sort of tomorrow I can actually try one or two of these things. I really appreciate that. I also want to thank Lauren very much for helping us with the technical support, more than technical support in this case, because of course Gwen set us an extra challenge of breakout rooms, etc. So thanks to Lauren for that. And Lily, thanks for coming out on a Sunday evening. And thanks to all our participants. And tomorrow, Lauren will actually put together a post note, which we'll send to you with links to all the documents. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.
Thank you.